break here to bring in Ken Gross, our election law specialist. He has something to say about this last witness, Tom Spencer, a Miami lawyer, a Republican activist, a Miami-Dade canvassing board observer. Ken, you found significance in this Bush witness, didn't you?
Well, I think this witness was helpful to the Bush campaign. He cast doubt on the whole process that was used in Miami-Dade to even conduct the partial recounts that they conducted, which was a basis for a full recount, which they never completed, as you might recall. When the Supreme Court ruled that they had a short time frame, it was based on that reason that they didn't recount. His basis, his thesis was there shouldn't have been a recount at all in the first place, because the basis, the sampling that was used for a full recount was from heavily Democratic counties, not representative of the, from heavily Democratic precincts, not representative of the entire Miami-Dade county, and therefore the extrapolation of this sample, which would show a basis or an error rate as a basis for a full recount, was inappropriate. Now, the Gore lawyers on cross-examination said, really tried to pin him down and saying, well, that may all be true, but isn't it still true that there were 9,000 votes that were not recounted by hand? And he, of course, admitted to that. Judge Sauls, interestingly enough, in his questioning at the end, didn't focus so much on that. He wanted to know what standards were being used in the actual review of the ballots that were recounted. And it sounds as if the different canvassing judges were actually using different standards. One seemed to be using the Palm Beach standard, where if you had one dimple but there were no other dimples, you wouldn't count that, and another one was counting them if you had just one dimple on the card, even though there were no other dimples. So that was interesting in and of itself.
We'll get back to the hearing at the Leon County Courthouse in Tallahassee, Florida, but first we'll take a break. Judge N. Sanders Sauls in Tallahassee, Florida, was talking about a 12-hour hearing. That was wishful thinking. On the stand on the second day of this contest trial is Thomas Spargo, another Miami-Dade County Canvassing Board observer.
I want to ask you some particular questions about what you observed. Did you have, though, before I do that, did you have any other occasion after the 21st to see any of the Miami-Dade County employees handling ballots or otherwise dealing with ballots? Your own observation.
No, I didn't. I came in there on Wednesday morning.
I think you answered his question. So let's just stick right to his question, if you will, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Spargo, let's talk about what you observed on November 19th. Would you tell Judge Sauls, in as much detail as you can remember, what you observed on November 19 with respect to this partial manual recount?
On the 19th was in the, that was the sorting room, and what I recall first that morning, on Sunday morning, was an application was made by a representative of the Republican Party to, if you will, vacuum up the chads and vacuum the floors so that we could have, if you will, an inventory or an accurate estimation of whether or not new chads were generated as a result of the sorting process. And
you mean the third machine sorting, so you could get to see what were the so-called undervotes?
Yes, yes. And that request was denied by the 3 members of the canvassing board who were present in the room. And at that time you could see, if you will, an accumulation on the rugs pretty much. And so there was no willingness, if you will, to allow an inventory process for the new chads.
Did you try to preserve that amount of shad as evidence?
Well, we did. We asked if the rugs could be rolled up and, you know, that we could isolate the new generated chad, but that was denied as well.
All right. Are we talking about 1, 2, or 3 shad that you saw on the floor of the counting tables, not the counting tables, on the floor of the machine room on November 19? Or are we how much shad are we talking about?
Well, there was at the beginning of the morning after the request was denied, I just kind of walked around the room and visibly observed the rugs and the floor, and kind of made my own estimate of how much was there, and there was none on the tables. And at the end of the day, and during the course of the day, I would examine the tables and the floor around these counting machines. There are 12 machines, I think, that were actually used. And there was a substantial accumulation of Chad being generated in this process. And periodically, I'd count the accumulation of Chad either on the tables or around the floor where it's spilled.
Would you tell the court about how much new Chad had been generated with this third machine recount on November 19th that you personally observed?
I say estimate. There was at least 1,000 new pieces of Chad, minimum, in the course of this that was being generated in that process. And you'd see that on the tables by where the machines were, very fast counting the ballots, and then accumulated around the base of the machines. And it was also tracked because there were people walking around and moving. It was also being tracked newly over into the area where they were restoring the trays.
Were these 1,000 Chad what you were trying to ask the Miami-Dade County to sweep up and hold so that if anybody sometime wanted to see it and determine whether this created a problem for degradation of those ballots as evidence, that the court, Judge Sauls, could take a look at them?
Absolutely. We wanted to differentiate the Chad that had been used in previous elections that may have been accumulating on the floor in the rugs, and isolate the newly created Chad that resulted from this sorting.
Okay. Let's talk about November 20 and 21. First, tell me just generally what you observed on those 2 days. Set the picture for all of us of where you were and what others were doing with respect to what turned out to be a partial manual recount.
The process would begin each morning with the 2 employees on opposite sides of the table, at least Monday, and then there would be a Republican observer and a Democrat Party observer at the end of that table. Each of the tables had placed thereon a piece of paper with the number of the position of the presidential ballot, so that Vice President Gore was 6 and Governor Bush was 4, and the other candidates had their numbers there. Then there was a place for overcounts and undercounts ballots to be placed, and the process began by the ballots being placed on the table. Only the board or county employees were allowed to touch the ballots. There was virtually no, if you will, communication or dialogue between the watchers or observers and the county employees. And there began a process whereby the county employees would pass the ballot from one to the other and turning it so that the observers could see that there was no Chad and that there were no overcounts and that the ballot was correctly placed in the pile for the candidate for whom the ballot had been cast.
Let me stop you. So on November 20 and 21, employees of Miami-Dade County were, and I'm not accusing them of anything, but were bending the ballots and looking at the ballots at these 25 tables?
I'm not sure that at that point I would characterize in that part of the process that they were actually doing that. It was more of a holding it out and observing it. There was a lot during the course of the handling, especially after they'd been put in piles. They were then placed in piles of 10, and during the course of that you began to see this process of, if you will, fanning, and the way many people were counting them. You'd see that they were actually rubbing their fingers right over the area where the presidential column was, so that there was a manipulation that was going on during the course of this process.
Well, when you say manipulation, let's be clear, that word has 2 meanings. You're not suggesting that Miami-Dade County employees were manipulating the ballots in order to create votes where there weren't any, are you?
No, no. By manipulation, what I mean is there was a manual process going on whereby the ballots were being handled and or fanned and or twisted so as to be able to allow them to be, counted.
Okay. At the end of this 2 days, or over the course of these 2 days, which mount up to a total of 24 hours, 12 hours on the 20th, 12 hours on the 21st, during that time, did you have further occasion to see shad?
There would be an accumulation of Chad periodically at some tables, but it was by no means what we'd seen on the 19th floor. But periodically you'd go over to a table and there would be 3 or 4 new pieces of Chad on the tables, and you'd either see it or in many instances a watcher would call you over and say, what are we supposed to do with the Chad? And of course we didn't touch it, and we just made a note of it.
All right, sir. And in addition to the county employees handling these ballots, in fact, the 3 members of the board from time to time handle certain of the ballots, correct?
Yes.
All right. And when the canvassing board was handling it, and in particular